What's up, ProGuides family? How are you doing? And welcome back to another ProGuides Wild Rift video. Today we have got 5 of the most underrated champions on this list, but don't forget, we can't account for all regions as they play different champions all the time, because obviously they value them differently. Anyway, let's go. Number 1 on this list is Annie. Annie has been nerfed quite some time ago and then fell under the radar. But the question is, why? This champion still provides many things that are actually crazy in the solo queue environment. Obviously she's no Katarina, but she still has some moves up her sleeves, which can make her quite the menace to deal with. Every AD carry, and especially jungler, can tell you a story about her tibbers. Anyway, let's start with her laning phase and what she does in lane. In lane, Annie is infamous for her auto-attack range. Back in the past, on the League PC, she even had her auto-attack range nerfed, because, well, it was too unbelievably broken. She hit you from 10km range, and you got punished for basically nothing. However, in Wild Rift, her auto-attack range and her skill set are still pretty fine, and easily a tool you can abuse to punish enemies. But what does this champion in fact do? This champion has one specific go-to move, which is technically very foreseeable, but you never expect it because you don't see it. Because of the limited range on the devices for Wild Rift, you don't always see when she's about to engage. Because for her engage, she's going to use a flash ability and a proto belt. This is so much range that is covered in a mere second that you can't always see it coming if you don't play with a semi-locked camera. So if you're playing with the locked camera, it's very likely for you to get caught in the crossfire many times. And why exactly is it better than you think it is? Annie's damage is just crazy. Her base damage is absurdly high and she offers quite a few tools that even help in a utility type of sense. She has a stun and she has a shield for allies. But most importantly, her stun isn't only limited to one target, as she can stun multiple people at once depending on what spell she's going to use to do it. And since we're already talking about stuns, this mechanic is also very important for the laning phase, or overall. So for example, in lane, stack up your passive and threaten the enemy when he goes for CS. By the time you walk up to the enemy, he has to respect you, and if he doesn't walk back, you'll get an easy electrocute trade-in, for literally free, because well, if you stun the enemy, he can't fight back, and then all you need is one additional spell plus an auto attack and your electrocute is procced. Then you can back off again and repeat the same process shortly after. And for hitting level 5, the moment you do so, you can basically insta-kill any enemy at any point in the game. Unless they have a ruby crystal and barrier, they're going to die if you have ignite available. So for runes, make sure to take electrocute, for stamina spells flash and ignite, and for the build Rod of Ages and Rabadon. This grants you the highest AP possible, plus some nice tankiness. If you're feeling really fancy, you can also argue going for Ludens first. It grants you more cooldown reduction, but makes you way less tanky. So given the identity of Annie, it's probably better to just go Rod of Ages, just safer and easier to maneuver with. And since I've shown you like a little pocket pick here, what about your personal pocket pick? Let me know in the comments below. Next up is a champion that's also quite tanky. This champion is a pick and ban in the Asian region. However, in this region, it's not necessarily picked all the time. It's not a bad champion, not at all, it's just under the radar. Other champions have stepped up quite much, and therefore we don't see her too much. She's also not a champion you blind pick, because there's too many options to shut her down, especially in a teamfight environment. However, if a Diana gets going, there's little to nothing to stop her. Her damage is just too crazy and her mobility, if she plays well, are unmatched or similar to a Katarina. So what does our champion do? Our champion, in fact, struggles the most on level 1 to 3. It is the time we need to get levels in, and then we can play the game. Before that, for example, on level 1, we can only really poke with our first ability. In most instances, we also have to start with a ruby crystal, because we are a melee champion and in the mid lane we are often facing ranged champions. So we are just on the survival duty, until we can in fact hit back. The earliest we can do so on level 2 by skilling our third ability. This way, if we position our first ability well, we can jump onto the enemy, go for a very quick trade and then jump back to a minion which is still marked by the moonlight. Doing so will grant you a cooldown reset on the third ability. However, starting level 3, we have access to our shield, which gives us another shield if we full proc it in melee range. If you combine this with with the power of the ruby crystal we already have, we are super tanky in the laning phase, which makes us quite beefy in terms of trading. Then after we get our resets off, we want to go for a Rod of Ages as fast as possible. We want to get that item scaling. And since we are a melee champion, we really need those HPs. Without those, we'll just die in an instant and well, it's not a good time. But now we come to the point why she's so insane if you play her well. Her ultimate ability applies Moonlight to all the target it hits, which means you have infinite dashes, and if you're really good, you can utilize the auto-attack reset on the dash, which is a major increase in DPS. But to make sure that you utilize the champion to its fullest potential, you have to probably wait a bit until you go in. The reason is, if you jump into a team that has still all their CC abilities available, you'll get CC'd in an instant and just killed. Or your ultimate get cancelled, and then you just don't deal any damage. Another thing you have to take notice of is checking the scoreboard if the enemy team has an exhaust. Exhaust is probably the hardest counter to the Diana, as it annoys her the most in what she wants to do. And now we move on to our next champion, Jax. He is also a scaling monster, and especially on the side lane he takes care of the enemy once he is scaled quite magnificently. His damage is absolutely nuts if you know how it actually works. But let's speak about what this champion does. Well, this champion beats you up without even using a real weapon. But jokes aside, he's a tanky bruiser that loves to deal damage over time. His DPS is quite high, you might even say that he's an AD carry for the top lane position. With one different aspect. He gets super tanky. However, there are a few things that make the champion kind of annoying to play. His first ability feels kind of clunky, and his third ability doesn't block all the spells it's supposed to do. And by spells in this case, I mean attacks. Because for example, Fiora's first ability, technically speaking, is an auto attack, but it still goes through his third ability, which is kind of confusing. Maybe it's a bug, maybe it gets fixed, we don't know, but we can wait. But the true beauty of this champion is the fact that you can build super tanky. You basically only need 2 damage items in the form of probably a Triforce and the Blade of the Rune King. The order is up to you, and afterwards you can go into like a full tank build. That is enough to kill any carry in the game because, well, you are immune to normal auto attacks if you use your third ability, plus the bonus resistances from your ultimate ability, on top of your health and other bonus resistances, make you extremely durable. And here's some little advice in terms of trading. Think of the passive of your ultimate ability when you go for trades. Hit a minion twice and then go in for a trade. And then use the auto attack cancel from your second ability on top for even more damage. It's basically like 4 auto attacks in 2. And if you take into consideration that you can then use your third ability and the enemy can't hit you back, you'll get more auto attacks in, and then there's no room for the enemy to actually respond. And with that said, we go on to our next champion. OLAF. OLAF has been ridiculously underplayed in recent times. He used to be such a powerhouse, but then just kind of fell under the radar. In the past, he used to be a top tier jungler. However, now OLAF is not only a jungler, he is also a champion you can pick in lane. You can pick him, for example, in the middle lane into certain matchups and in the top lane into certain matchups. On top of that, he still remains a valid jungler in some cases, so he's a perfect flex pick if you want to confuse the enemy with what you're trying to do. But in the end, he's not really a first pickable character because there are too many things like, for example, a J4 who can lock you in and then you become kind of useless. But if you combine the right items, which I'm going to tell you after, and the right champions, you're in for a good time. The go-to combo in the past has been an OLAF with a Lulu, and it's still kinda broken, because Lulu is absolutely bonkers. This champion is just not balanced and you can't tell me otherwise. And since Lulu grants you a lot of damage, and your champion doesn't really need that many offensive items, you can build absolutely tanky and still run down the enemy team on your own. Even just the death stance is enough to make you a full tank, at least it feels like this. But there's also a few things you have to take notice of. OLAF can really struggle with mana if you don't pay attention to your first ability's mana cost. If you throw it too often, you'll find yourself completely drained and kind of with your pants down. And in addition to this, you have to have a specific mindset when playing this champion. Usually, the lower a champion goes in terms of HP, the more threatened you feel. But for OLAF, it's a bit different. The lower you get, the more attack speed you will gain and the more damage you will output, which significantly impacts the trade you're currently in. So basically, if you're fighting, you keep on fighting until either of you dies. It sounds kinda weird, but well, it is how it is. Especially with your second ability, you'll go crazy. A lot of attack speed, lifesteal, and therefore tons of damage. So for runes, make sure to take Conqueror, for summoner spells Smite and Ghost and sometimes Flash, but mostly Ghost because your champion runs into the enemy and Ghost just does way better than Flash in that regard. For items, build Death Stance first. It grants you the best stats available for your champion. Other than that, on your second item you can think about Starrick's Gauge and a Black Cleaver, and if you can't decide between which, you just build the other one as your third item. For boots, you'll mostly go Tabi because your ultimate cleanses all CC and makes you immune to C anyway. Therefore mercs are not really an option for you unless you want to waste some of your stats. For the enchantments, you'll mostly decide between Glory and Gargoyle, depending on what you're facing. And with that, we get over to our very last champion of this list, Lucian. He has been the king of the mid lane for ages, basically for patches. However, he was then repeatedly nerfed into the ground, and now he is still kinda strong, but for different reasons. But let's start with his laning phase. In lane, Lucian remains a bully. They changed his scaling, but buffed his early game quite a bit, but he was already strong in the early game and relied on heavy snowball, so it didn't really make sense in that regard. Nonetheless, here are a few tricks on what you can do. For example, in lane, take extra time and make sure you aim your first ability properly. You want to punish the enemy when he's out of your auto attack range. If you repeat this a few times, you can even dash in on the following levels and punish the enemy with an easy and clean kill. There are little to no champions that can properly reply to this, so you'll have an easy time. But if you try to dash in immediately without poking them first, well, they'll poke you back, and if it's a champion like Corki or Orianna, they'll actually win this. Because what stops them from running away after you've dashed in and you don't have access to your ultimate ability? And as long as they trade one spell for one spell, it's still completely fine. However, you want to pressure them with your damage and force them to run away, unable to respond in any scenario. But now let's talk about the items and summoner spells. For the runes, you want to take Conqueror as per usual. For summoner spells, Flash and Barrier, and sometimes even Ignite if you're feeling extra fancy. For the build, there's something special. You want to rush a BF sword into a Caulfield's hammer, and then you want to complete the charge blade. With the two components of BF sword and Caulfield's, you'll pay 2,700 gold for 65 AD. That's the highest amount of AD you can get for the cheapest price, and you'll get it before Dragon without even getting a kill. However, if you were to end up getting a kill and you'd have enough gold for the IE, you would complete the IE first naturally. Afterwards, you want to build a charge blade. So basically your first completed item would be a charge blade if nothing happens. With this, you're removing most of the RNG, as it's now a 1 in 2 chance of you to crit, plus the bonus damage from the item itself. And since you're using a lot of spells, it kind of feels nicely. And with that, we go to our last point for Lucian. Lucian becomes a god tier champion on 3 items, which usually consist of Infinity Edge, Navori Quick Blades, and Charge Blade, having 100% crit on cast after casting a spell, and getting a cooldown refund with every hit we do that crits. And since Lucian is a spell-weaving AD carry, this is most likely better than an armor pen item at this point. Because if you think about this, the more spells you have, the more passive auto attacks you'll have, and the more effective DPS you'll get. Even though they deal, for example, 10% less damage due to the lack of armor pen. And that basically wraps up today's video. Thank you all for watching, leave a sub and catch you tomorrow for more Challenger Wild Rift content.